I'm Bill Smith. I live in Lumberton, Lees, and I'm a member of Morristown Monthly Meeting. I have a checkered past in terms of Quakerism, being a Quaker pastor's son in Indiana, and then moving for the last 30-some years to New Jersey. So I have some experience with unprogrammed friends. I have as a hobby Quaker history, and I also served on the Faith and Practice Vision Committee for Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. That took 11 years for us to do the revision. Now, I took a 2-year vacation from that committee and went to Hawaii, so I didn't do the whole 11 years. And the committee changed over time. One thing that I like to tell people is this committee was a perfectly good example of unity in the spirit, in that we had very wide theological views in the committee, but we all worked together to try and come up with something that fit Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. The passage that was read in meeting this morning really speaks to this, because it talks about the inward light, and but also talks about all the different kinds of things. So it's talking about the inward light of Christ, but also recognizing that this inward light of Christ has all kinds of other definitions, and people can even talk about the inward light without necessarily being a theist. So the idea is you have language that doesn't cut off your roots, but also doesn't cut anybody else off of being part of the community. So what I'm going to talk about today is what's the history of discipline in Quakers, in the Society of Friends. Faith and practice is a relatively modern term for the books that we use. To begin with, go back to why we need to have this in the first place. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay. I've been accused of being a British Quaker because I keep using the year 1652 as the beginning of Quakerism. And there are a lot of people who realize that there were people with the views of Quakerism before 1652, but it didn't take off until 1652. In 1652, George Fox preached, and Furbank fell to 1,000 people. And 2 of his future travelers, called the first publishers of truth, were there as well, Halkill and Dewsbury. Then what happened was Fox sent out, or the leaders sent out people in pairs. And they first said that we sent out the Valiant 70, because that's what Jesus sends out in one part in the New Testament. He sends out 70 pairs of people to go out and preach the gospel. And people didn't like that, because that sounded like Fox was trying to be Jesus. And so they called it the Valiant 60. Neither one of those numbers are right. There were over 100 people in pairs that went out, and they included women as well, and some teenagers as well. So these were called the first publishers of truth. So they went out and spread the truth. And part of that truth was that each person can experience, without ceremonies, without priests or rites or any kind of special kinds of things, each person can get their own view of the truth. And that's what they went out to spread. and it spread like, typically we say, wildfire. And in that case, so that these people went out and think, this is actually a drawing of Fox on the on Burbank Fell, on Fox's pulpit, which is a big rock. If you've ever been on the Quaker tour with the students in the Friends schools in Britain called the Foxtrot, if you do that, you'll get to see this. And there was no central body, there was no central place that dictated to these people who went. They went all over the place. They went to the Far East, well, not Far East, the Middle East, and they went to Europe, and they went to Ireland, they went to Scotland, didn't do very well in Scotland, don't know why, but they didn't, and they went to the Americas, the Caribbean and North America. And so, but there was no particular thing. The first thing that began to happen was a lot of these people who were traveling began to write pamphlets. Now, I don't know how many of you know that this was happening during the Civil War in England. The first part of it, they beheaded the Charles I, and then they had the Commonwealth with Cromwell, and then they had Charles II. They now have Charles III. Not a direct line, but anyway, Charles III. And this group of people began, there was no real censorship on publications. And so anybody could write and publish a pamphlet and distribute it. And there were a number of printers who printed Quaker pamphlets. And a lot of pamphlets went out describing the practices and the doctrines of the early Friends. And it was some individual's viewpoint. It was not coming from a central, there was not a central publishing company or a central editorial board yet. What happened was these people who were traveling began to write letters. And if you wrote a letter, where were you going to send it for Quakerism? Well, you sent it to Swarthmore Hall. Swarthmore Hall was the home of Margaret and Thomas Fell. Thomas Fell was a magistrate. He never became a Quaker, but he allowed Swarthmore Hall to be a Quaker meeting. It allowed Margaret to organize communications. So people would, from outside, would write in, send in to Swarthmore Hall. Then things would be sent back, and other things would be sent back, and they'd be distributed. So there began to be a central location for ideas and things to be passed through. So that's Swarthmore, and that's Swarthmore Hall in the background. That's another part of the Foxtrot. Anyway, so next one. Okay. Now, what happens is Friends insisted that God's truth was the same all the time. So what I got as God's truth would be the same as anybody else's God's truth. And so we'd have unity. Well, there's a problem with that. And that is the truth is coming through the human. God's truth may never change, but the way in which people interpret it can be very different. And so what happens is you begin to not have the ability to say, well, everybody is in unity. So Friends, the emphasis on the individual experience and discernment of God's leadings actually was began to create problems. Okay, next. There were two major people in Quakerism who really exemplified this. One was James Naylor, and James Naylor was a very important publisher of truth in the North. He actually went with Fox and Farnworth when they first went to Swarthmore Hall. And he actually is the one who convinced Thomas Fell to believe, to at least accept Quaker teachings, and he also defended them in court and in that particular realm. But he then went to London, and a lot of what happened to Quakerism is that the north of England was the beginning place for Quakers. And Quakers are almost all only there, but when the Publishers of Truth went out, you began to have other places. And so one major place that was important was London, important in England and important to Quakers. And so that became a center. A lot of meetings were in London, and James Naylor had gone to London to be a preacher, a missionary, so to speak. And he had become, well, some people like to say he had a bunch of groupies, female groupies. Some of them, there were some men and some women who felt he was the real leader of Quakerism. And he made a big mistake. He went and emulated Christ's entry into Jerusalem, the triumphal entry, and in Bristol. There is a number of people, different people look at Naylor in different ways. Some people look at him as totally bad. Some people look at him partly bad. Some of them look at him as he did the right thing. Because what he was trying to do was to emphasize that everybody can be Christ. So you can be so filled with the Spirit that you're Christ-like. Not just limited to Jesus, but Eastern Orthodoxy has the same kind of concepts as that. But what happened was the Bristol Quakers rejected him, and the Bristol government arrested him. He was then tried in Parliament. He was found guilty, and he was branded with the B on his forehead for blasphemy. He also was whipped from pillar to post. Now, pillar is what's in the center of a town, and the post is on the edge of town, usually north, east, south, west. So if you're whipped from pillar to post, you're whipped from the center of town to the edge of town and back, then to the other pillar, then to the other pillar, and the other pillar. So he was whipped many times. Right? He also had, and what some statements say is that he was had a hot iron bore through his tongue. Well, the hot iron was probably an iron wire. Bad enough to have a hot iron wire put through your tongue, but if you think about something like a poker or something, you wouldn't have a tongue left. So, but that's a nasty kind of thing. He was then put in prison for an unlimited amount of time. He ended up coming back. The big problem was that Fox and other leaders, including the Quakers in Bristol, really were upset by this. And they broke off with Naylor. And you can read all kinds of stories about what the differences were. But this was a time when somebody was saying, they were saying, we need discipline. Now we have John Perot. If you look him up, you'll see that John Perot was an Irish poet. Right? That's what some lookups on the Google tell you about him. But he was also a Quaker, and he left with Mary Fisher. You all know who Mary Fisher was? No? Okay, Mary Fisher went to the Sultan in Constantinople, and but on the way she had real tough times going along. Perot was with her group that was going, and she ended up talking to the Sultan and it was a very good meeting. However, along the way, they stopped in Rome. Perot attempted to, he never talked to the Pope or anything, but he attempted to convert the Pope. Well, again, do you know what was going on at this time? We're talking about the 1660s. The inquest, all right? And Perot came a crop of the inquest, and they ended up putting him in the insane asylum, Bedlam, the place for insane people. During this time, he suffered a lot of physical and mental abuse. He was also still corresponding with people in England, the Quakers. And that was in 1658. He then, when he returned back to London in 1666, he found that the Quaker establishment, the meetings in London, and the meetings in London were basically what we now call monthly meetings. But they weren't, that wasn't established yet. And they had meetings of elders. Now, elders in Quakerism at that time meant somebody who was longer being a Quaker than somebody else. So there was a George Fox and there was a George Fox the Younger. But George Fox the Younger was older than the George Fox we know about, but he was younger in the movement. So Perot came back, and there was things. So the question, what he proposed that caused problems was the practice was that if somebody was praying, people would take their hat off because in the presence of God. Hat honor was when you took your hat off to anybody who was above you. And the Quakers didn't do that. They left their hats on. There's a story that a guy came in and didn't take his hat off in front of his friends, and they said, "What are thee, a Quaker?" And so that, but God was recognized as being higher than humans. So taking the hat off would be hat honor to God. Well, Perot said, that's just a practice. And women don't take their hats off, don't take their bonnets off. So why should the men? And so that became a problem. And he also did not want meetings for worship planned. You should have a meeting for worship when the Spirit moves. Well, there's only one difficulty with that. Then you'd have lots of single or double people meetings rather than large groups. And so that was also a problem. Those are real minor things, but what happened was a whole group got saying that Fox and the leaders were wrong. And so they were going off in their own way. And so what happens is, next, and the reason that's under red, I didn't realize that. Red is because the typical Perot that we see is P-E-R-O-T, former candidate for president. But this one is P-R-R-O-T. Spelled, pronounced the same, but anyway. So what happens about this time is that a group of elders in the north, which is where Balby is, and there's still a meeting house there, and that's still a meeting. They got together and said, let's make a list of the things that people should do if they're Quaker. And this is practices. This isn't doctrine. There's no business about, Jesus being the savior or any of that kind of stuff. It's all things like, don't gossip. If you're married, you should be treating your wife as an equal. Those kind of things were put in this list. There are a list of 20 of them. All right. And so then in 1660, there's a group in London, and they call themselves the publication is called From the Brethren in London. And so they then propose a set of practices that would be Quaker. And if you're going away from the general trend, then you're really not being a Quaker. You have to, you should be within the range of differences that we accept in order to do that. This meeting did not, neither of these meetings included George Fox, because he was in prison and not allowed to speak to any Quakers from 1664 to 1666. Okay. So these are not things that Fox, and by this time, Fox is becoming the major leader in Quakerism. He's still not the only leader. One of the things that's happening at this time is those leaders are dying off. Hubblethorne, major publisher of pamphlets in Quakerism, died in 1664, I think. And Farnworth died, Howgill died. A lot of these either died in prison or died from prison. I mean, in other words, anyway, if you've ever been to this period prisons in England, they are miserable places. And there are cases where there are descriptions of when somebody is, you okay? Anyway, that they're in here in the winter and the wind is coming through the slats in the side. So they're sitting in a place, or they're in a basement with urine and fecal material and straw on the floor. So they're really miserable places. And so these people got became weak and maybe even caught something in those places.
Can you be interrupted with questions, or
sure,
shall it be held to the end?
Sure.
Okay, you have a question. Why was Fox incarcerated? What did he do?
In that case, typically what happened was they would be, they're known for preaching out in the street and causing a disruption. And so they might be taken in for disruption. Then what they do is they don't swear. All right. They don't say, I'll tell the truth. And the reason is because they tell the truth all the time. Why should I swear to tell the truth? They don't take off their hat in front of the magistrate. So they get charged with contempt of court. And contempt of court has no sentence to it. You serve until they release you. Okay. Now, I'm not sure exactly what caused this one, but he was in prison a number of times. And most Quakers were, or at least the leaders were, okay? The preachers. They did things like interrupt church services and this kind of, to tell the truth. Okay. All right. I was going to.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Did the Quakerism start in northern England, physically, geographically?
No, in the sense that all the people I've mentioned, all the names I've mentioned, came north from Middle England. From the middle of England, yes. And so there were little groups in the middle of England, but what they were doing was they went north. I've never read what drove them north. Part of that is the story of Fox climbing Pendle Hill. And he looks out and he sees a group in white, this great group that's going to become, and most of the group that he talked to on Fairbanks Fell probably were wearing white, because there was a weavers, time for weavers to get jobs in Sedberg. And so maybe a number of those people were in white. So it's an interesting, now, of course, Fox wrote his journal years after he actually did things. So you never know whether he's
Yeah.
he's seeing the coming of his vision from one thing or another.
Depending on his memory.
Yeah, yes, yes. And dictating to somebody and who then wrote them down. So it's
3 chances.
3 chances. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. You had a question?
No,
Same thing?
yeah.
Okay, yeah. But the group that came out and went out to everywhere were from the north. Most of those people names are northern names from places from what's now called Cambria, around Lancaster and Sedberg and
Also, I had an Irish friend that told me that there was an Irish movement of Quakers.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Penn was converted or convinced in Ireland. William Penn was by a traveling Englishman, English Quaker, but okay. All right, let's see. All right. All right. So we got the fact that Fox was not involved in this. Well, what happened is that Fox gets released from prison and he immediately begins traveling around Ireland and England, and he ends up in London. And when he gets to London, they have a meeting that in the first meeting we talked about was in May of 1666, and he led a meeting in September of 1666 after he got out of prison. This particular group produced a document, and this document was called by detractors. It was actually published by other groups. And let's see. Detractors called the document the Canons and Institutions Against, get my eyes together here, agreed upon at a general meeting of the Quakers in 1669. This is supposedly written by Fox, this document. It's never been called a document, canons and institutions agreed upon and thing by Quakers. This is other groups that are saying this is bad. And of course it had George Fox as the president and typical, and it was called a synod because these were non-Quaker groups that were doing this. Now, there is a person called Rosemary Moore who has become the historian for this period. Her first book is after her thesis, and it's called The Light in Their Conscience. Penn State Publishing does this. And this talks about this era that we're talking about very much. She has a recent book, 2018, that's 2018. It's called The History of Quakerism, or it's Quakerism, or the Quakers from 1656 to 1732. And there is a rewriting of this period. The history that everybody talks about is Braithwaite's, the second period of Quakerism. And what people have done is go back and look at the original documents from that era. Britain Yearly Meeting has archives that go way back to the beginning, and they kept every single document that Quakers wrote, and they kept every single document that anti-Quakers wrote. So often you can learn more things about a movement by the people that are complaining about what they're doing, because they may even be more elaborate in their explanation for that. This document separates what Rosemary Moore and others now agree This separates the beginning of Quakerism from the next part of Quakerism. The difference from the free, open, well, I'm going to use the word evangelistic, but we've got that so messed up now that it no longer is. It means spreading the good news. No longer just spreading the good news. They're now having an organization. They've got a group. And so they need to begin to have some kind of discipline for the group. The bright idea of Fox, and probably Margaret Fell, is that we should organize in monthly meetings, quarterly meetings, and yearly meetings. The first of those to form are the yearly meetings. So that you have yearly meetings in London from 1672 to the present. That would be the yearly meeting, and the people would come to that. To begin with, only men. But very quickly, Fox and Margaret Fell proposed that we have to have women's meetings so that the women have a say. In 17th century England, if you're a woman and your husband's in the same room as you, you don't talk. He talks for you, just like today. No. Anyway, my wife is shaking her head. Anyway, so what happens is if you have a business and you're trying to make a decision, all you get are the men's views. And the only way you're going to get women's views if the women meet together and make up and decide on things, and then they can send those things to the men's meeting. The first thing that's given to the women's meetings is the oversight of marriage. This caused, anyway, so once begin, I'm gonna skip what I was gonna say because otherwise we'd be here till no. Anyway, once the yearly meetings are formed, they become the source of discipline. That means they're the ones who set practice policies, soon becoming things like, what is worship, things like that. That's what they begin to happen. Okay, and in 1738, and London, I'm going to use the term that was used this time, London yearly meeting was the mother church. In other words, they were the ones that set the policies and set the organizations for everywhere else. And I'm not including just in England, I'm talking about in North America and the Caribbean. Quakers were very big in the Caribbean. I mean, there were lots of Quakers in the Caribbean early on. Barbados was the main place. And Barbados now has no Quakers at all on it. I once did a Google map from where Quakers would leave in England and to Barbados. It's a straight line on the surface, which means it's curved. Right? So when they left England, the first place they'd hit would be Barbados. And so you hear Fox goes to Barbados before he goes to anywhere else. It's true of lots of other people. Perot gets banned to Barbados and otherwise. So what they did was they began to, and the term manuscript originally means that it was manually written. So what they did was they'd write minutes and they'd send them out to the other meetings. And the other meetings would then record those in their minutes. And those things would be sent out to the monthly meetings in the yearly meeting. And so this becomes it's called Christian Brotherly Advices Given, oh, and spell check doesn't like plural advices. But it's a legitimate word. Anyway, given forth for time by the yearly meetings in London. The topics were in alphabetical order. And this is the way all yearly meetings for a number of years later worked. They would have paragraphs on a particular topic, like scripture or something like that. And then they would order them in alphabetical. The first printed, actually, and I couldn't find when I was doing this research, the actual date, but the printed version of a list of discipline, the book of discipline, was in New England Yearly Meeting. They printed theirs before London Yearly Meeting did in 1783. However, the New England Yearly Meeting set of book of discipline contained almost all of the paragraphs were from the London Yearly Meeting manuscript. So now, then it becomes, in 1783, it becomes the extracts from minutes and advices. So then you have a book of extracts, and the book of extracts then is what your yearly meeting is sending out to monthly meetings and quarterly meetings and meetings that are under the yearly meeting. And it goes back quite a bit that the yearly meeting is the source of the discipline, the source of what should be done, what's correct. And okay, all right. Yes,
Can I
Mrs.
go
Smith.
back for a minute? Where did the extracts were from what?
Oh, the extracts were from the meetings, the minutes of the yearly meeting. In other words, if the yearly meeting passed a minute that said, there's an example, I have an example later of a minute that and has a date, and they're dated, so that you may have the 1690 book of discipline, set of discipline that's sent out, and in it might be minutes from years before, and that would then been kept. This is still what we feel, and so we'll put this down. And right, so they didn't revise it every minute or so, and that's not even been true lately, even lately. Okay, all right. That answer your question?
Yes, it did.
Okay. Now, what happens is that this begin to they divided in 1861. The rules differences were published as 3 chapters, and Christian practice, Christian doctrine, and church government. This in 1883 became 3 different books. And the 3 different books went on for a long time. So you could get a book of the book of Christian discipline. And I have a 1955 edition of that book. And it's on that thin paper that Bibles have sometimes, and with a leather cover. My father bought it in East Africa. So anyway, so but that's one. And then they would have another one in government, another one on the, let's see, practices. So you have doctrines, practices, and church government. Britain Yearly Meeting in their Faith and Practice still talks about church government. There were probably people who wanted to change that in the current sense. And, okay, now we're going to move to the United States, North America. 1828 is an important year in North American Quakerism. What happened in 1827, 28? What's the most important thing that happened in American Quakerism? The Great Schism. she doesn't count. She's heard me enough times. Yeah, the Great Schism. And the Great Schism happened in, well, it happened before. The big difference, what happened was you had the first Great Awakening, which means it was evangelical, the Methodist kind of thing, where people became much stronger in their religion. And you had that happening. But at the same time, what you had was the Enlightenment, which was the furtherance of reason as a way to deal with things. So you had at the time two different ways of going. One was the Bible and Christian history, and the other was reason and using your brain and thinking things through. And if they had Birthright in the time, a Birthright Quaker called Tom Paine wrote about the freedom and the bringing about of reason over other kinds of things. So you had those two things happening, and so therefore Quakerism began to have people, particularly in the cities, who were very much wanting to be part of the society, which was part of this Great Awakening. And in the country, you had people who wanted to maintain the historic Quakerism. So a split happened at Arch Street in 1827, and one group walked out on the other. The particular thing they were worried about was who was going to be clerk. The clerk's term had come to an end, and they needed to have a new clerk. Well, they couldn't agree. Well, part of Quaker policy is that if you can't get unity, you keep with what you got. Well, it turns out the person that was clerk was on one side, and the group that walked out was on the other side. They later became called the Orthodox and the Hicksite. Probably Elias Hicks would have been upset that people called it Hicksite, because I don't think they directly followed what he said, but that's what people called them. They didn't call themselves Hicksites, and the other group didn't call themselves Orthodox. They both called themselves the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting of the Society of Friends, period. Okay. So you had two Philadelphia yearly meetings. One of the ways that yearly meetings kept in contact was epistles. So these two yearly meetings sent out epistles, and they came to other yearly meetings. And those yearly meetings had to decide which one they were going to accept. And well, we have all kinds of stories about people breaking a board in the balcony and saying, the balcony is falling. And so all the people who didn't know that was a joke ran out of the building, and the other guys shut the door and accepted the minute from, I'm not even sure which group it was. There is also a story about a man going to Brooklyn, Brooklyn meeting with his sword to be sure the right decision was made. This time was not a very Quakerly time as we think about it, but it really created a problem because it created Orthodox. But by the way, Orthodox doesn't mean Orthodox Quakers, it means Orthodox Protestants. Their orthodoxy was the divinity of Christ, the sacrifice of Christ for our sins, and those kind of things. That's the Orthodox part. Hicksites had become known as liberals, but the Hicksites were the conservatives. They were the ones who wanted to maintain the practices of the Society of Friends. And so those two, they were not very apart. I heard the other day from somebody who probably knows, but probably heard from his family, is that the only way you could tell a Hicksite from an Orthodox was in a meeting. The Orthodox twiddled their thumbs one way and the Hicksites twiddled their thumbs the other. It probably was a little different than that, but they kept the same book of discipline for years. So if you looked at Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, Arch Street, and Philadelphia Yearly 15th Street meeting, which 15th Street is the Hicksites and Arch Street is the Orthodox. Their books of discipline are very much the same until quite a bit later, because they're just listings alphabetically of minutes from the past. Let's see. Okay. Try the next one. Let's see. Oh, and this is out of the 1806 Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, Faith and Practice. And this is, we tenderly and earnestly advise and exhort all parents, blah, blah. It's really saying we need to have the scripture as part of our daily life. But it says 1732. And it says 1732 because that's when the advice or the minute was passed. So here you have in 1806, you have, almost 100 years before, something that everybody is keeping. It's saying this is what we still believe. And so they didn't change something if they still agreed with it. Okay. All right. You do. So after 1826, there were two major branches of Quakerism for about 6 or 7 years. The Hicksite and Orthodox schism had little effect on disciplines until the 1880s. And it's not because the Hicksites changed their books of discipline, it's because the Orthodox changed their books of discipline. Friends in both branches went on using the same books of discipline. Gurneyite schism in Orthodox yearly meetings brought about changes in this discipline. Okay, Orthodox yearly meetings, Gurneyite, okay, next. And of course, these are spelled right, it's just the spell check doesn't know Quaker terms. Your spell check, mine does, mine wouldn't have the red lines under it because they're in the dictionary now. In 1887, the Conference of Orthodox Quaker Yearly Meetings, including the Britain Yearly Meeting and Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, met in Richmond, Indiana, and made a declaration of faith. The basic reason for that was to stop the use of water baptism and Eucharist in some yearly meetings, some meetings in Ohio, Damascus yearly meeting. But it had lots of other things in it. It was actually written by a Briton named Brathwaite, same guy who wrote first period and second period of Quakerism, the major historical looks at the early Quakerism that were done with Rufus Jones in the early part of the 19th, 20th century. Right? So then in 1897, they decided that they would have every 5 years, they would have conferences to see what they all agreed on. In 1897, the conferences of the year that particular set of Orthodox came together, and they accepted the Richmond Declaration of Faith, proposed a uniform discipline for the Gurneyite yearly meetings in the United States. Now, that didn't include other Orthodox that were not part of the Gurneyite movement. Gurneyite movement is named for J.J. Gurney, a British banker and Quaker who traveled in the United States and had great impact. Philadelphia Yearly Meeting didn't let him speak once, but didn't speak very much. He spoke in front of Congress and very influential person. One of the things he wanted to do is have Quakers work with other denominations and things like anti-slavery and prison reform and things like that. But he was much more Orthodox Christian than some earlier Quakers would have been. But they put his, just like they did with Hicks, they put his name on this group. Let's see. Oh, yeah. So they called it the Constitution and Discipline for the American Yearly Meetings of Friends. In 1897, at that same conference where it was accepted, New England, Wilmington, Indiana, Kansas Yearly Meeting accepted as the Book of Discipline. In 1901, the 5 years meeting, what they did was they then codified that thing that was meeting every 5 years. And they said, we are now the 5 years yearly meeting, and this is an organization of yearly meetings. And so it's called it is now called Friends United Meeting. And that's partly because some Hicksites and Orthodox came together. And so you really, and they meet every 3 years. So it's something else. Just, yeah.
No,
That's okay.
good.
Yeah, I used to say when I was teaching, I said, say, you have to go to the bathroom. Okay, so in 1901, you had uniform discipline was accepted by California, New York, Western, which is in Indiana, and Baltimore. And in 1902, it was accepted by Oregon, North Carolina, and Iowa. And in 1908, when it started, Nebraska Yearly Meeting accepted this. Let's see.
I have a question.
I think at least 4 of these are no longer part of, yes.
That New England, Wilmington, is that Wilmington, Massachusetts?
No, that's Wilmington, Ohio.
Okay. I wouldn't have guessed it. Okay.
No, that's it. So we all have different geographical perspectives. Right? My dad was the pastor in Wilmington Yearly Meeting. I have a very good friend who was there. Well, there's also Wilmington College, which is Quaker College, not the one in Wilmington. Anyway, so all of these accepted this particular thing. I have a copy of I have a digital copy of the 1902 Baltimore Yearly Meeting. And the Baltimore Yearly Meeting accepted, in 1901, accepted this Constitution and Discipline for Friends. And if you look at it, it sounds almost a lot like a regular Protestant document. And that's taken from the minutes of Baltimore Yearly Meeting Friends. And I have the virtual copy is a copy of Alan C. Thomas's he was clerk of the yearly meeting at that time. I'm getting okay, next. Now, what happens in these Gurneyite yearly meetings, it becomes very much that they are very, and now that evangelical becomes what we normally now think of as evangelical, not just spreading the good news, but it's the evangelical kind of things like you think about Southern Baptists, and a lot of Baptist groups. So, the only early Quaker source that's quoted in these is an excerpt from George Fox's letter to the governor of Barbados. which reads like a typical Protestant statement of faith. And the reason Fox wrote it was he was going to Barbados and he wanted a friendly, he wanted the governor to be friendly. So he wrote something that was very normal, rather than something that was very different. But that's become something that very evangelical Gurneyite friends have used, and they put it in their faith and practice. Usually included the 1887 Richmond Declaration. You can find that on the web. You can also find anti-Richmond Declaration statements from Quakers. Now, what happens is you have that, everybody has that in the 5 years meeting as the discipline. In 1940, it is proposed that the 1897 Uniform Discipline be updated and revised. This has some personal meaning to me because my dad was on the committee that was going to do this. And I don't know whether I still have it or not, but I have a document written back and forth in the committee about how they're going through and doing this. But the ensuing publication, Faith and Practice, the 5 years meeting, never got off the drawing board because there was such disagreements on what should be accepted. Some places would accept one part, some would accept another. Some people would say, we'll accept this part, but we want to change this part in it. And so not all the early meetings did that. So the publication was never accepted. It never became, so the FU, at the same time, the Friends General Conference did the same kind of thing. And it never got accepted as a general thing. In fact, it's not very public that there even was. It kind of got hidden in the things. Chuck Quaker actually dug up a copy of it. And if you don't know who Chuck Quaker is, don't worry about it.
I think we all know who it is.
Okay, he's called the gadfly of Quakerism. Anyway, okay, so Indiana, this is from Indiana Yearly Meeting, current 2018 version. I don't know whether my cousins were involved in it or not, but he's the treasurer of Indiana Yearly Meeting. And Indiana Yearly Meeting has recently split into two groups, the Association of Friends and Indiana Yearly Meeting. So they have things like creating environments that empower churches and individuals to be disciples of Jesus Christ and to make disciples of Jesus Christ. They have the letter to the governor of Barbados, and they have the Richmond Declaration of Faith in their faith and practice, and are very much well, my cousin had a Trump sign at the front of his driveway. So anyway, I don't know whether he still has anything to do with Trump or not, but he's also a local politician. Orthodox Yearly Meetings, Wilburite and conservative. There was another group of Orthodox that came through. And next one, please. Okay. There was a guy named Wilbur who actually followed Gurney around. Gurney would show up at a meeting and talk, and then Wilbur would come. And Wilbur was saying we need to be the same that we have always been. Gurneyite Yearly Meetings went pastoral in the middle of the 19th century. They began to have pastors, and all kind, and so they become very much like other churches, and they now call themselves churches. They don't call themselves meetings. If you come on in the Midwest, you come on a Friends church and it says Friends Meeting outside it, you know that they're worried about their tradition, the Quaker tradition. If you come along and it's a French church, they may have no idea about anything in terms of traditional Quakerism and don't care to. Right? So one thing about Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Orthodox never chose between Gurneyite and Wilburite. And the fact they didn't let Gurney talk in some of the meetings at all. But they were more Wilburite, so they were more conservative in terms of the way in which they dealt with Quaker tradition. And so they never got involved in that. So there really were a conservative yearly meeting, not just Orthodox. Okay, now next one, let's see. Okay. Oh. What happened was you had conservative yearly meetings. Yeah, okay. Ohio yearly meeting, there is the only one Ohio yearly meeting now. There used to be Ohio yearly meeting, Damascus. That's now the Eastern region of the Evangelical Friends Church. And so Ohio yearly meeting in East Ohio is the only directly descended Wilburite yearly meeting. Iowa and North Carolina are conservative yearly meetings, but they split from the Gurneyite, which means they tend to have a much more Christian view and a biblically centered view with a spiritual inward light center as well. And they have silent meetings, or they like to call them meetings for listening. So you're not just being quiet, what you're doing is listening for the Spirit. Okay. Let me quit soon. Yep. Okay. Let's go to the next one. Okay. Next, that's just to show that they do much more Spirit and Christ and that kind of thing, but it's very much the Spirit, Christ's Spirit, the inward light of Christ, that type of thing. Okay. Now, Hicksites until the 20th century weren't organized. They were just the 7 yearly meetings. Now they had conferences, but they had conference for men on philanthropy. They had conferences for women on religious education. So they would have conferences on a particular subject, but they never pulled together.
Religious ed.
Religious ed?
Religious education. One thing that pulled them together too.
First day school, yes.
First day school.
It's her thing. Okay, now there are, this is from 1927 from the Hicksite yearly meeting. It really is something that direct communication with God and this type of thing. So that's probably something that had been in the discipline for years. Not something that was brand new. Okay, we'll move along here. Now, I learned something in the last, well, I learned things before that, but in Indiana yearly meeting Hicksite, first off, I grew up in Indiana, mainly in Indiana, and Indiana yearly meeting anyway. And I didn't know there was a Hicksite in the yearly meeting in Indiana. And I had to come east to have somebody talk to me about saying, well, the Hicksite meeting, we used to drive by the Hicksite meeting every time we left the yearly meeting. And I said, Hicksite, and they said, yeah, oh, that's now the Wayne County Historical Society. And I had gone by that place for years, not knowing it was an old Quaker meeting house. Anyway, Indiana Yearly Meeting Hicksite kind of was spread into Ohio. And so you now have the Ohio Valley Yearly Meeting of the Religious Society of Friends, which is a direct descendant of the Indiana Yearly Meeting Hicksite.
Were
And-
they the ones who had the meetings for listening?
No, that's the conservatives, North Carolina conservative. Yes,
Okay, thank you.
okay, yeah. You had that question?
It's in the chat box.
Yeah, no, that's and the conservatives tend to do that, both Iowa and North Carolina. You like to use the term meeting for listening, which I like. And I think silent meeting is not necessarily a good thing. Okay, so next one. This is the introduction to the Hicksite. It's the statement from Barnaby elders, which you all may be familiar with. It says, "Dearly beloved friends, these things we do not lay upon you as a rule or a form to walk by, but that all with a measure of light, which is pure and holy, may be guided." So in other words, it's saying what we're writing here is not meant to be, you're supposed to interpret it in your own way. It's not something that's gospel, so to speak. You don't not follow it word by word. And that's also in Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Faith and Practice prominently. Okay, next. It's Ohio Yearly Meeting introduction, and it's talking about divine truth and the gifts of God. They haven't left God out, which is what somebody suggested we do when I was working on the revision committee, is that we should just take God out of our faith and practice. And the committee said, no, because that's our roots. Now you can interpret what you want, but our roots are Christian and God-based. Okay. Now, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. We'll go quickly through this. Faith and Practice was first adopted for the 1952, 52, 55. This is the unified Faith and Practice, Hicksite Orthodox. It was actually passed before the official, was passed by both yearly meetings before the two of them. I hate to say the word united because I'm not sure united is the right kind of, just they met together and they had only one yearly meeting and all of these things. Okay. And I have at least some friends who like this one better than everything up to 2018. And that person happened to be on the committee with me and for revision, because all these revisions did all kinds of different things to try and make everybody happy. And when you try and make everybody happy, you tend to make no one happy. And so a lot of those things that went on weren't really making 1955 better than what it was. We think that the 2018 one does do that. Okay, we thought the right one. The only problem I have with this is not a testimony of simplicity. Now, I was working as a docent at Art Street at the time, and we said to the person who was in charge of it at the time, she's no longer there, I said, it's your fault. You got that on there just to advertise. She said, I had nothing to do with it. Not me. I didn't want to do that. But so it's a nice cover, you know, but as you can see, if you look at it, the beginning part of this, the addition of faith and practice, we're going to go through, intended to be a guide, not a rule for our members and attenders, others who seek to understand Elbrin's in our year meeting, express our faith in our lives. community organization. Okay, so it's kind of saying this is something that is an expression. Okay, next. Now, some of the changes that happened in this, other changes, we changed the place faith before history, almost over my dead body, but in the end, I can say that that's really important. What we really need to say is, what are we today? And then say, this is where we came from. Added more resources. So if you go to the back of the Faith and Practice, you got all the different organizations that are Quaker related, and you've got all kinds of different things that you can do. We kept significant extracts, and that was discerned by having separate surveys sent out and other input. We had allowed people to write in and email and all of the things for their favorite extract, the one that they would not want to go. And we usually got a number from anyone, not just one, but a number. And what we did was add more recent extracts. In other words, the 2072 had no extracts after 1970. So there were no modern extracts at all in there, because somebody had gone through and set up a whole set of extracts that they would like, and they just adopted those. So we went through and looked for, so if you look in the extracts today, there will be there. Now, that doesn't mean you can't go back and get another copy and read the old extracts. The point is, you don't want too many extracts. If you just keep adding, it's going to get bigger than what. So we added recent extracts that are significant. We updated the queries to be more modern than what they had been. And we didn't edit the queries. We wrote new queries in the same general area. And it was organized into a little different way. We did not include the yearly meeting structure, the yearly meeting organization, because the yearly meeting, in between the last revision and this revision, the yearly meeting organization had changed 5 times. So there's no sense in putting it in this. We now have a website. We now have reports from the yearly meeting on structure and this kind of thing. So there's no reason to hold to anyone on structure. Okay. And again, the elders of Barby statement is here. Okay, next. I think we're about done there. Hopefully, a few more. All right. Like early friends, we proclaim that every person has been endowed with the capacity to enter directly, without mediation, into an empowering relationship with God. And that was Jerry. You said you were at a meeting where I was talking about whether we capitalized God or made it lowercase or used G-D. Right. And we decided that we'll just use the root where it came from. And also, like those, we gather in expectant silence with other seekers, opening to movement of the Spirit in ourselves, individually, in our worshiping community. Worshiping probably is spelled wrong. Oh. Anyway, so and that's another one that opens up. We're not looking. It's not saying, didn't use the word God again, and this is the following statement, one after the other. But it allowed people to deal with the idea of spiritual rather than theistic, right? I guess that's pretty good. And friends seek to experience the present of living God in individual religious practice and in meetings for worship and for business.